All right, this video presentation is going to deal with the types of cells and the cell theory. As you know, cells are considered to be the smallest unit of life. We talked about the characteristics of life, and one of them was you had to be made from cells. And this is why viruses cannot be considered living, because to be a cell, you have to have certain parts. For example, to be a cell, you have to have something called a plasma membrane. Well, viruses don't have one. To be a cell, you have to have cytoplasm. Viruses don't have that. To be a cell, you have to have ribosomes. Viruses don't have that. And the parts of the cells are called organelles, and that is going to be in a different video. What we're going to look at in this video are the people who we give credit to discovering cells or talking about what cells are and giving cells very specific definitions, as well as coming up with what we call the cell theory. Now, just a little background information. Robert Hooke is the gentleman who is credited with naming cells. He was actually looking at different types of materials underneath a very primitive microscope, and he began to notice when he looked at cork, which people used to bottle wine with, that the cork had a very specific pattern to it. And when he looked underneath the microscope, he saw what looked like these little blocks. They look like the rooms of a monastery where he was doing some of his work. And the rooms of a monastery are called cells. Just like, in a prison is called a cell because it's a certain shape. Well, the shape that he saw on the cork tissue reminded him of the cells. So he is the person that we give credit to with naming the cell. Now, were there other people who probably looked at the cells or looked at plant tissues? Yes. But we actually have very detailed writings from Hooke where he explains his observations and he calls these things the cell. So that's why we give him credit for actually naming what the cell was. Now, the cells that he looked at were dead. Cork is made from dead wood, and so these cells would have hollowed out, and all that would be left behind is the thick cell wall. And so that's what gave it this building or this brick effect. We then had van Leeuwenhoek, and van Leeuwenhoek was actually before Hooke, but he is one of the gentlemen that we give credit to for actually first viewing living organisms with a microscope. Now, this was in the 1600s, so their microscopes were nothing like our microscopes. And this is actually a little picture of what the microscopes from that time look like. It was basically like a big magnifying glass. But again, he took different things and looked at them in this microscope. He would take rainwater. He would take spit. He would grind up like leaf juice and look at it. And he noticed things moving in the rainwater or in the pond water or in saliva. He would look at blood. And so he didn't actually talk about cells, but he is the first gentleman that we actually, again, have detailed reports on where he talked about these things that he saw. And we now know that these were actually living organisms, probably unicellular organisms, which are, they're alive, they're one cell. And he has very detailed descriptions of what he saw back in that time. Which leads us to these three gentlemen. Now, you and I, we've known our whole lives that plants were made of cells. Ever since we were little, we've known what a cell was. But you have to remember when these gentlemen were alive, this whole idea, the microscopes are getting better, and this whole idea of science and studying science was brand new. And this gentleman, Matthias Schleiden, is again the first gentleman that we give credit to with saying that all plants are made of cells. He has very detailed writing where he studied all these different types of plants, and he discovered they all had the same shaped structures. And by then we had the word cell, and he was, to you and I, this is common sense. Well, it's common sense because this man actually did the studies, did the experiments, and wrote all the papers and all the research. So Matthias Schleiden is the gentleman we give credit to for saying all plants are made of cells. Well, likewise, somebody had to come along and say, all right, well, all animals are made of cells. And that is Schwann. And I always remember him because Schwann sounds like a swan, and a swan is an animal. And all animals are made of cells. And I will admit, if you look at this picture here, these are actually onion cells. Animal cells are not square. Animal cells are round, and on my PowerPoint that I created, there are animal cells there, but apparently when it comes over, it shows up as onion cells. I don't know why. I'll have to research that and figure that out. But anyway, Schwann said that all animals were made of cells. And again, this would be common sense to you and I, but it's common sense because we now know what cells are. Ever since we were little, in early science in elementary school, we talked about how things are made of cells. Common sense because of this gentleman here, which led us to Virchow. And Virchow is the first gentleman, again, that we give credit to for saying that cells come from other cells. Now, there will always be an evolutionary viewpoint when we look at biology, and the fact that things just don't spontaneously form. However, the question has always been, in this case, is where did the first cell come from? But you have to have cells to make cells. They have to reproduce. Just like you have to have a mom and dad or two parents to make a child. Okay? You have to have organisms to make an organism. And so he is the first gentleman who said to say that all cells come from other cells. However, at the same time, the first question is always, well, where did that first cell come from? Now, evolutionists and creationists both have their own ideas, which we're not going to get into with this video. But Virchow, again, said all cells come from other cells, but we do recognize the fact, okay, well, where did that first cell come from then? When you put all three of these ideas together, we come up with what we call the cell theory. Now, remember, a theory, by definition, is a hypothesis that's been tested over and over and over again, and you always come to about the same conclusion. You need to know the three parts of the cell theory, and they're in no particular order. The first part is, just like Virchow and Schwann and Schleiden said, all organisms are made of cells. Now remember, back in the day, you were either a plant or you're an animal. That's all they recognized. If you had a cell wall, you were called a plant. If you didn't have a cell wall, you were called an animal. If you look like a plant, like a fungus, you're called a plant. If you didn't look like a plant, you're called an animal. So based on Virchow, Schleiden, and Schwann's initial ideas, all organisms are made of cells. Well, we are now more technologically advanced, so we now know there's a difference between algae and plants. Seaweed is not a plant. Okay? Seaweed's in a whole nother group. Looks like a plant, does photosynthesis like a plant, but it's not a plant because we have very distinct definitions as to what does it mean to be a plant. However, it is made of cells. So all organisms, as you know, are made of cells. Some organisms are unicellular. Like this picture here, this is an example of a euglena. It is a pond water living organism. Bacteria are unicellular. Amoebas are unicellular. The bacteria kingdoms and a lot of the members of the protista kingdoms, or kingdom protista, are unicellular. Multicellular, like us, like plants, they are made of many cells. So again, unicellular means you only have one cell. And so this is an example of bacillus bacteria. Now they might all live together, but each individual bacteria, one cell can do its thing. As humans, we are multicellular. Okay? We have to have all of our cells working together in order to make us as an organism. Which leads us to the second part of the cell theory, these levels of organization. The cell is the basic unit of life, which means the cell is the building blocks. If you follow the evolutionary pathway, it is believed that bacteria evolved on Earth first. They're unicellular. They were single cells. From that, we got members of kingdom protista. They're also unicellular, most of them. And at some point in time, cells began to work together. And when you have a group of cells working together to perform a function, that is a tissue. Keep in mind, unicellular organisms are just cells. Only multicellular organisms can be tissues, organs, organ systems to make what we call organism. Unicellular creatures like an amoeba, a bacteria, they're still organisms. We just tend to use the term organism when we talk about a multicellular creature. But cells are your basic unit of life. When you have groups of cells working together to perform a common function, we call that a tissue. So for example, in humans, we have trillions of cells. Well, those cells will basically form clubs, and they'll work together, and that forms our 4 kinds of tissues. In humans, we have what's called epithelial tissue, which are membranes, connective tissue, things like blood, bone, cartilage. We have nervous tissue, and we have muscle tissue. So of all those trillions of cells we have in our body, they come together to form one of 4 kinds of tissues. So by definition, tissues are groups of cells that work together to perform a common function. Now, when you have groups of tissues working together to perform a common function, that gives you an organ. So for example, in the case of our stomach has certain types of tissues in it, and those tissues work in a certain way to give the stomach its job. Brain has different kinds of tissues. So they're going to work together differently, so your brain's going to work different from your stomach. Then, when you have a group of organs working together to perform a common function, you should see the pattern by now, we call that an organ system. Like when your stomach, small intestine, large intestine, all those work together, you've got your digestive system. And then when you put all the body systems together, that makes our multicellular organism. So again, tissues are groups of cells that work together, organs are groups of tissues that work together, organ systems are groups of organs that work together to make your multicellular organism, as you can see here. Now, what we have found in nature is that we actually have 2 categories of cells. Oh, sorry, I forgot the third one, the cell theory. And the last part is, like Virchow said, the cell theory is that all cells come from other cells. In the case of making new cells, we can do what's called mitosis, and we can do what's called meiosis in nature. Mitosis is a form of asexual reproduction where the cells simply make copies of themselves. So for example, in humans, we use mitosis in order to grow and to repair. So you lose 40 to 50,000 skin cells a day. So you need to make 40 to 50,000 skin cells every day. And they need to be copies of each other. So our bodies do mitosis, or what's called asexual reproduction, simply to make copies of skin cells. Meiosis is how nature makes egg and sperm. Mitosis and meiosis sound a lot alike. They are a lot alike, but they do end up making different things. So there will be another video about cell division, mitosis, and cell division, meiosis later on. Now, like I was mentioning in nature, we actually have 2 categories of cells. And for years, we didn't have the technology to know this. But we now take all the cells in nature and we divide them into 2 groups. The first group is this thing called a prokaryote. Now, the root word pro means before. Like if you do a prototype, it's kind of like a model of what you want to make. And kary, K-A-R-Y, means center or focus or what we call the nucleus. So the term prokaryote means before the nucleus. Prokaryotes are what probably formed first here on Earth. These are primitive cells. And what I mean by that is they're before the nucleus. Prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. And you're like, okay, well, what's the nucleus? Well, you've heard of a nucleus your whole life. Right? The nucleus is where what people call the brain of the cell. I call it the bank because in the bank, we lock away real important things. Well, the most important thing you have in your cell is your DNA, which you know is your genetic material. Well, the job of the nucleus is to protect your DNA. It's basically like having a safe that we lock our DNA up in so our DNA can't get mutated. Well, prokaryotes get their name because they do not have a nucleus. This is why bacteria can mutate and change so quickly. Oh, and by the way, as you can see here, bacteria are prokaryotes. So in the case of prokaryotes, they get their name because they don't have a nucleus. And if you find a cell that does not have a nucleus, it's automatically called a bacteria. And when I was going through high school, if you were a bacteria, you were in what we call kingdom Monera. However, we've discovered that there are very different types of bacteria, and it's different enough that we had to take kingdom Monera and split it up into kingdom Archaeobacteria and kingdom Eubacteria, which we'll discuss more later. But if you are a prokaryote, you're automatically considered to be a bacteria. Now, in the case of prokaryotes, again, they do not have a nucleus, so there's nothing protecting their DNA. And speaking of their DNA, they only have one piece of DNA, and it tends to be in a circle. So it's like you taking a long piece of string and tying it together. Or if you have a necklace, okay, that's what their DNA looks like. It's just one piece of DNA. Now it might be tangled up, as you can see in this picture, to look like, a bunch of spaghetti. But if you were to take it out and unwind it, it'd just be one big circle. Prokaryotes are unicellular. They're never multicellular, they're always unicellular. And they're very simple. And what we mean by simple is they're not going to have a lot of parts. Okay? For example, to be a cell, you have to have what's called a plasma membrane or a cell membrane. They have it. To be a cell, you have to have what's called the cytoplasm. They have it. To be a cell, you have to have these things called ribosomes. And you can see ribosomes here in this picture. Ribosomes are always drawn as polka dots. And ribosomes make proteins for the cell. And proteins are incredibly important. You are you because of the proteins you make. Every cell works the way that it works because of the proteins that it makes. So your brain cells work the way that they work because they have this kind of protein in it. And your stomach cells work differently because they have a different kind of protein in it. Proteins are what make all of your cells different. So bacteria are bacteria because they make certain proteins. And so ribosomes are what make their proteins. They don't have all the other parts of the cells. They're not going to have what's called the Golgi body. They're not going to have vacuoles. They're not going to have vesicles. They're not going to have endoplasmic reticulum. Things that chloroplast, or some bacteria have chloroplast. So they're not going to have all these other parts. They're very simple. They're very plain. They just have a few parts in them. So again, if you're a prokaryote, you're simple, always unicellular. You have one piece of DNA, and it tends to be in the shape of a circle, and you do not have a nucleus. And if you're a prokaryote, we automatically call you a bacteria. All the other cells in nature are what we call a eukaryote. So things called protist, algae, fungi, plants, and animals. The root word EU means true or real, and again, kary means nucleus. So eukaryotic means it has a nucleus. It has this box that we use to hold the DNA, and that's going to help protect the DNA. So the term eukaryotic means it has a nucleus, and that nucleus is going to hold the DNA, and it's going to help protect it. Think of the nucleus as a safe. Eukaryotic cells are complex, which means they have a lot of pieces in them. They're going to have a nucleus, they're going to have something called a ribosome, they're going to have these things called mitochondria, they'll have things called Golgi bodies, centrioles, cytoskeleton, smooth endoplasmic reticulum, rough endoplasmic reticulum, perioxysomes, lysosomes, vacuoles, vesicles, so lots of pieces, and we call these organelles. Also, most of your eukaryotic cells are multicellular. Can't say all, but most. For example, animals. All animals are eukaryotic, and all animals are multicellular. Plants. All plants are eukaryotic, and all plants are multicellular. Fungi are eukaryotic, and 99.99999% of fungi are multicellular. We'll talk about that 0.00001% later. But in the case of what we call kingdom protista, in kingdom protista, we have things like euglena, amoebas, molds, mildews, and algae. Well, they're unicellular, but some algae, like seaweed, are multicellular. So if you're a eukaryote, if you're a prokaryote, you don't have a nucleus, you don't have a lot of parts, you're always unicellular, and you're automatically called a bacteria. If you're a eukaryote, you're complex because you have all these different membrane-bound organelles. If you think of a eukaryotic cell as a city, it's going to have lots of different buildings inside of it, and those buildings have different jobs. Just like here, we have grocery stores, we have department stores, we have bakeries, we have factories, we have office buildings, we have police departments, we have the post office. All of these are found in the eukaryotic cell. They're mostly multicellular. They do have a nucleus, and that nucleus is going to help protect their DNA. And so basically, any type of cell in nature that's not a bacteria is a eukaryote.